I know Representative Gary Click, one of really the best in the country, of course in the state of Ohio, but across the nation. And yeah, absolutely.
And we're going to have Representative Click and Klopfenstein for sponsor testimony.
But there's no more local control than Bob and Betty Buckeye.
Well, that explains why he keeps saying, well, that's not the way Representative Click does it.
I'm not supposed to get emotional, but I am.
Then we sat down with Click to discuss his bill and the controversy surrounding it.
And the chair would like to invite Representative Click to present testimony.
The question is, shall the bill pass? The chair recognizes Representative Click.
Welcome back to What's Clickin' with State Representative Gary Click. I'm Janae Myers, his legislative aide. Today, we have a very special episode for our listeners. We are doing a mailbag episode about a mailbag, about a specific bill.
Janae. Just kidding. It's all
well,
planned.
I figured I'd surprise you today.
I'm used to seeing fake outrage all the time, so I just figured I would try and see how it works.
Well, it's a very special episode nonetheless. We have a bill, you have a bill that is gaining speed incredibly fast. Yeah. The Kirk American Heritage Act. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that before we jump into the podcast?
Yeah, this bill has just blown up, mostly in good ways, I think. And this bill addresses, there's been an underlying problem, and sort of the assassination of Charlie Kirk really kind of hit home, and it says, okay, now's the time to actually act on this. And part of our problem that we've had is that good teachers sometimes feel inhibited. They feel inhibited because they feel like they're going to be sued or get threatening letters from hate groups and things like that if they dare to teach the positive impacts of Christianity on American history. And the fact is, you cannot separate American history from the Christian religion. Now, as I often say, one of the things that we fought for was religious freedom and religious liberty. And that's the freedom to be Christian, to be an atheist. It's the freedom to be a Catholic or a Baptist or a Protestant. It's the freedom to believe, not to believe. It's freedom to be a Muslim, to be a Hindu, whatever it is. But it was Christianity that actually led the charge in that freedom. And part of that was because there were some Christians who were persecuting other Christians. And then there were Christians who said, no, we have to have absolute religious liberty, not just tolerance, but freedom and liberty. And they many of them came to America for that. That wasn't the only reason that people came, but it was a predominant reason. And the Pilgrims, for instance, that was actually a church, and that doesn't get taught like it ought to be taught. In fact, when we talked about this, and the bill outlines at least 20, maybe 24, depending on how you count, because some of them got subpoints, just points about, here are some things that are examples of our Christian heritage that you should be able to be taught, that should be able to be taught in our schools without someone saying, oh, you're proselytizing, because we don't want proselytization. We don't want people trying to make converts. That's what happens in church, not what happens in school. But to say this is the basis of the freedom, these people came for these reasons, and to speak about that positively is not a violation of the First Amendment. It's not a violation of the principles of separation in church and state. And we want our teachers to be free to teach. We want to remove those invisible shackles, is the word that I use, a phrase that I used, and it's been quoted often even by the opponents of the bill. And we just want them to be free to do that. And we saw in our opponent testimony this last week that we couldn't get the ACLU to say that they wouldn't sue or send a nasty letter, even though they said this bill's unnecessary because it's already legal. I said, okay, so when somebody else files, whose side are you going to be on? Are you going to defend the teacher, or are you going to be suing the teacher? He says, well, we don't typically sue teachers right off the bat. We send letters first. Well, okay, so are you going to send the letter warning the teacher to stop teaching it, or are you going to defend the teacher's right to teach history? Some people call it your Christian bill. It's not a Christian bill. It's a history bill. And we are not in the business of indoctrinating the students. That's not what I want any teacher to do. But the whole process, we got some people in opponents who said it's already legal, so it's not necessary. Others were saying this is unconstitutional, which shows you why we need this bill. And I think you said you've got some letters on that
Yes,
topic.
we do.
And I have not seen these letters. So I know you've got some in favor and some opposed. And so we're just going to try to respond. I'm going to try to respond. You're going to put me on the spot. I'm going to respond extemporaneously, and we'll see what happens today.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of our first correspondents that we got is actually positive about this bill. He
Woohoo!
mentions the impact of Christianity on the founders of our nation cannot be overstated. We owe it to our students to share the truth about the importance of religion and faith in the formation of our country. Representative, do you want to speak to that a little bit?
Well, I think we owe our students truth. And that's all. That's all we want, and that I think that's absolutely a true statement. They need to understand the truth, because if we untether our future from our past, then we lose our the moorings that held us together. How did we become such a great nation? And it was because of those principles that they fought for. That doesn't mean you have to be a Christian. I am one. I think you're one too.
I
But you
am.
don't have to be a Christian to. And I've got friends. As a matter of fact, I was just talking to one of my Muslim friends this week. He says, "Oh yeah, I support this bill. Of course it is." And one of the reasons he said that is because he knows that his liberties to worship according to his faith have the roots in our American heritage. John Leland was a Baptist pastor who was big, huge in fighting for our liberties here in America. He had a great influence on James Madison, on Thomas Jefferson, and even George Washington. And one of the things that he said, because seen a lot of persecution of the Baptists in that day here in America. And he said, listen, it doesn't matter what your religion is. You can be a Christian, you can be a Jew, you can be a Muslim. He said, as long as you love the country, you are honest, and you are elected by your neighbors to serve, then you should be able to serve your country. And so he understands that. Matter of fact, the first time I ever met him is he said, something I never thought I would hear from a Muslim. He said, "We need more Christians in the legislature," and so he and I struck up a good friendship, and we have different faiths, but one thing we both agree on is we understand, number one, the freedom of religion, and that applies to everyone, not just to Christians. It applies to everyone, but we also understand that freedom was brought to us. One of the things I often say is, all religions are equally free, but not all religions contributed equally to that freedom. And that's not to be critical of other religions. It's just to tell the accurate history. And there were Christians who were on both sides of the issue, to be honest. And some people say, well, can you teach the negative aspects of Christianity? And I said, well, that's already being done, and nobody's worried about doing that part. But can we teach the positive aspects as well? And make sure that people understand that, and it's not that there's any negative aspects of Christianity, because there's not, but there are Christians who have at times acted in an unchristian manner. And I use as an example President Lincoln's second inaugural address, where he actually talked about in the Civil War, there were Christians who tried to use the Bible to justify slavery, and that was wrong, and that's not biblical. The whole book of Philemon is a book against slavery. And he says, don't treat this man, Onesimus, as your slave. He said, treat him as your brother. And that is a liberating passage, a liberating piece of scripture right there. But it was Christians who, the nickels and dimes of the Sunday schools that paid for the Tuskegee Institute, it was the Christians who were the abolitionists who fought for the freedom. Now, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Started the civil rights movement in the basement of a Baptist church. And he actually lectured some of the Christians who were sitting on the sidelines. And he called for them to be engaged and involved, and they should have been engaged and involved. I agree with him. That is a positive aspect of Christianity that should be taught. But some people were actually surprised to learn that at the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial in Washington, D.C., it says not one word about him being a Christian, not one word about him being a pastor, not one word about that whole movement starting in a church. And that's what we call deconstruction. They're not teaching a lie, but they're not teaching the truth either.
Mhm.
And we just think the truth ought to be taught. So that was a very long answer to a very short email.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so incredibly important to know all this. Another constituent writes in that the separation of church and school is grounded on the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment, which prohibits public schools from endorsing or promoting religion. She continues on to say that children learning about church and his school is not something that they want. Would you
Hmm.
mind just talking about this? You've addressed
Did
this
they
in
actually say the
speeches
separation
before.
of church and school?
Yes.
Well, first of all, it's the church and state, but the state is the school. And really, as the gentleman from the ACLU said, is uh, that requires neutrality. So neutrality means that you cannot censor out the truth just because you don't like it. And I just would remind this individual that we are not teaching religion, we are teaching history. And you can't, whitewash the history. You can't black out the part of the history that you don't like because it has something to do with religion. No, just tell the story and let the facts fall where they may. That's all we're asking
Absolutely.
for.
So, for the parents specifically who have
And,
written
and let me
in,
just back up and say that's why we need this bill, because there are people who say that's teaching the truth. And I don't mean the spiritual truth, I mean the historical facts is indoctrination. No, facts are facts. History is history. We should be able to teach that. And that is not indoctrination. And that's why we
Mhm.
need this bill.
So, for the parents who have written in specifically addressing that this bill is in honor of Charlie Kirk, a
Mm.
lot of people have some different stances on who he was and what he stood for. Do you want to speak to why this bill is written in honor of Charlie and how that's important
Yeah,
for our
absolutely.
school systems to understand?
Well, and I don't have the exact wording in front of me, but part of the language says that it's imperative that we learn our history to reduce hate, anger, and violence. And listen, Charlie was assassinated primarily for his faith. And when you ask Charlie, what did you want to be remembered for? That is so prophetic. Some of the questions that he was asked, in a sense, and they said, "What do you want to be remembered for?" And Charlie did not say, "I want to be remembered as a Trump supporter," although he was a Trump supporter. Charlie did not say, "I want to be remembered as a Republican," even though he was a Republican. Charlie did not say that he wanted to be remembered as a conservative, even though he was a conservative. He said, "I want to be remembered for my courage and my faith." And it, when he spoke, he talked about both. And you should be able to talk about both. There's no law against talking about both. And he talked about how his faith impacted his political views. And he would often talk about history and those things that we talk about. But the people who are uninformed and have an uninformed understanding of the history of the separation of church and state, which, by the way, came to us from Christians. It was Christians that asked for this. It was Roger Williams, who was a Baptist preacher who had been expelled because the government was trying to dictate religion. He had been expelled from Massachusetts Bay Colony, and he fled up north and he founded Providence, Rhode Island, on religious liberty. And he wrote this whole work called The Bloody Tenet of Persecution. And it was Roger Williams that came up with that phrase, a wall of separation between church and state. And by the way, he grabbed that out of Isaiah chapter 5, which we don't have time to delve into today. And he passed that on, and John Leland picked up on that. And John Leland was with Thomas Jefferson when he received a letter from the Danbury Baptist Association, and they were afraid of losing their religious liberties. And Jefferson had that conversation with Leland. Then he wrote back to them and he said, the Constitution has erected a wall of separation between church and state. And he got that from his conversation, most likely with John Leland, who, by the way, the next day he invited John Leland to preach to Congress, and he attended. And then it was John Leland earlier who went to Madison and said, "Hey, we need a Bill of Rights, and we need that protection, that religious freedom." And so Madison agreed to advocate for that. And it was put into the Bill of Rights, and the top signature on that Bill of Rights was Frederick Augustus Muhlenberg, who was the first Speaker of the House, who was also a pastor. So it was Christians and it was pastors that fought for that liberty to have that separation of church and state. But it was not an alienation of church and state. It was separate. They are institutions, not ideas. God is not forbidden. God is not banned from America. He's not banned from our public institutions. Look at your money. It says, "In God we trust." Say your Pledge of Allegiance, one nation under God. Look at your Constitution. It is dated in the year of our Lord, September the 12th, 1787. It is a reference that goes all the way back to the birth of Jesus Christ. And so it's not that we have to alienate religion, it's just that we don't indoctrinate in our public institutions. But to acknowledge God is not an indoctrination.
Yeah, absolutely. The next writer kind of addresses this and says the same thing you just said, where he says, "Thank you for your efforts for bringing truth back to the teacher and making them able to share this with their students as well. The Kirk American Heritage Act will allow teachers in Ohio to discuss the positive impacts of Christianity and the way it has impacted our country in the classrooms. Kirk's influence on America has allowed everyone in the business world to express their views on the marketplace." Do you want to speak to that at all? Obviously, you
Yeah.
just touched on that, but I think he
So,
highlights the
so
importance of
yeah.
Kirk and the way he allowed others to express their views, but he had dialogue with them.
Well. So the two things I would say is number one, it was I think it was that hate and intolerance because people were uninformed that took Charlie Kirk's life. The other thing I will say is I don't want to confuse this. This bill does not allow it because it's already allowed.
Hmm.
This bill affirms that it is already allowed. Even the ACLU said this is already allowed. And I said, so what side are you going to weigh in on when there's a conflict? And they wouldn't say. But it is already allowed by the First Amendment. But there is confusion about, as we can tell by the emails, as we can tell by the opponent testimony. Some people think it's already allowed. Some people don't think it is allowed. So it's very appropriate for the legislature to weigh in and say, yes, this is allowed. We want you to know this is allowed, and don't indoctrinate, don't proselytize, just tell the history the way it is, and you cannot be sued for doing that because the First Amendment protects you. That's all we're trying to do is give that extra layer of perfection, not perfection, but protection to affirm for our teachers. And I've talked to teachers and they tell me, yeah, we're afraid to teach on this because we're going to get a nasty letter. And one of the opponents said, well, all you got to do is ask for guidance and we can tell you that what's allowed and not allowed. And I said, well, first of all, I know that schools are going to be risk averse because even if they know they're right, they don't want to face a lawsuit. And they're going to say, yeah, it's better to avoid that kind of stuff. That's the message teachers get. Because they don't want to sue. They don't want to be sued even when they know that they're right. Number one, and I asked, the president of the Ohio Social Studies Council seems like a very pleasant lady. On the wrong side of this issue, though. And she said, well, we provide the guidance. I said, well, so when a teacher gets sued or get that nasty letter, do you have a lawyer that's going to come and defend them? And gave a long-winded answer that basically amounted to no. And Representative Brennan, who's a friend, he's on the other side of the aisle, but he kept saying, I don't know anybody that's ever afraid. And I'll be honest, I kind of felt like he was calling me a liar, which didn't make me happy because he keeps saying, nobody's afraid. I don't know anybody. I've never met anybody that's afraid. And the reality is I have. And so we want teachers to be free to teach the truth, not free to indoctrinate, but free to teach the historical facts about how our nation was founded. And so I appreciate that support from that citizen in Ohio who wrote in and said thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's so important that students in the next generation know the history of our nation. It's imperative. I believe it's Winston Churchill that says, "Those who do not know their history are doomed to repeat it."
Mm,
And
yeah.
so we, as the next generation, need to dive deeper into history. Do you want to speak to that? Do you want to speak to this? What would you say to the students who are experiencing a lack of proper history teaching of our nation? What are the impacts of that? How have you seen that in your life?
hmm Well, I'll be honest, many of these things I did not know until I was an adult, until I dug deeper in my studies. And so I was like, I don't know. Is this true? And I had to dig in and find it myself. And I went to a Christian school for part of my life. It's a great Christian school. I love it. It made a big difference in my life. But I went to both public and to Christian schools. but these things should be brought to the surface because they are it's the fountain of our liberties. And without this basis, the founding fathers, there's Donald S. Lutz did a study on what influenced them, and so many times we are taught they were influenced by Locke, and they were. Locke was also a Christian, by the way, who wrote two great works called "The Defense of Christianity." They were very scholarly and deep works. So to say that they're influenced by Locke is not contrary to being influenced by Christianity. It's the same thing. But there's also Montesquieu, and then there was Blackstone, and then there was also Hume. And so those folks are quoted, but when you compare all their quotations together, you might amount to about 19-20% of the citations. 34% of the citations of our founding fathers came from the scriptures. They looked all the way back to the book of Deuteronomy, which was basically setting up the government for the people of Israel as they went into the promised land. And they found the Republican form of government right there in the book of Deuteronomy. The Apostle Paul had a lot to say about civil government, especially in Romans 13. What's the purpose of government? The purpose of government is to reward good and to punish evil. What does our Declaration of Independence say? It says we are endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights. And then it says to secure these rights, governments are formed among men. So when we trace all of that back, Benjamin Franklin, he was not a Christian at all, but he was fond of Christianity and he was fond of the influence of the church. And that's why when at the Constitutional Convention, he called for prayer. He said, the longer I live, the more convincing proofs I see that God intervenes in the affairs of men. That is not actually a deistic statement. I'm not saying he's a Christian, but while he might have been a deist earlier in life, later in life, you begin to see, there is a God that is at work here. Thomas Jefferson said, the wrath of God cannot sleep forever. That's not a deistic statement either. And he was very fond of Christianity. He did not believe in the miracles. He did not believe in the deity of Jesus Christ. But when he edited his own Bible, which is not something any Christian would ever recommend doing. But what he did is he took out the miracles, but some people say, but really what he was trying to do is highlight the morals of Jesus Christ, because he thought the basic principles of Christianity, if you take out the theology, the principles were good. And so he was fond of Christianity. He just didn't buy into it all the way. But today there are people who are antagonistic. But we look at Thomas Paine, for instance. Thomas Paine he was not a believer in any shape, fashion, or form. But when he wrote Common Sense, which was a very pivotal pamphlet when we began our journey of independence, you know what he did? He quoted scripture. Why did he quote scripture? He quoted scripture because he knew that the majority of people in America are Christians, and that they would have to be convinced by the scriptures of these things. So he used the scripture. And later he wrote this book called The Age of Reason. Benjamin Franklin got a copy of that before he passed away. He saw some of the early writings, some of the early drafts, and he said he advised Thomas Paine to burn it. And he didn't burn it, but he didn't publish it until Franklin was dead. And so Franklin was restraining him from that. And of course, because America was so Christian, there wasn't even a cemetery that would allow him to be buried. And he had to be buried on the farm. That's all long story. There's an interesting book, not written by a Christian, but it's called The Trouble with Tom, and it's the strange afterlife of Thomas Paine. I learned a lot about this just by reading that. But yeah, and people ask me this, and some people may not like my answer to this, but people ask, are we a Christian nation? I was actually interviewed by public radio a couple of years ago, and my answer was, well, that just depends on how you define it. I don't usually describe us as a Christian nation because in the Bible, the word Christian is used only 3 times, and every time it's about people, not about nations. Only people have eternal souls. Nations do not have eternal souls. And so I don't think I would not use the word Christian nation, but I would say we were a nation of Christians mostly, but also of some deists, and also there was people of all kinds of faiths that were here in the beginning, but we were mostly a nation of Christians. And I reject the term Christian nationalism. I think that's a pejorative. I think that's a slur. I know some of my friends will use that, but most people don't, because we know that is often used to intimidate people. It's used to isolate people, which used to silence debate and discussion just by calling someone, a Christian nationalist, then that puts them on the defense and so forth. I don't use that term. I don't like that term. I think it's an inappropriate term. But I do think, and I do know it is a historic fact that Christianity had the most profound influence in the founding of our nation of anything. And that just simply is a story that deserves to be told in a non-proselytizing way.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Representative, I believe our time is about up. I
Okay.
loved this episode. I hope our listeners do too. But listeners, the Kirk American Heritage Act is now heading for its third hearing at some point soon for proponent testimony.
HB 486. Yep.
HB 486. So we will be keeping you posted about this. You've been listening to What's Clickin', the official podcast of State Representative Gary Click, covering Ohio's 88th House District. That includes Seneca and Sandusky counties in Northwest Ohio. I'm Janae Myers, his legislative aide. If you would like to reach out to us, you can send us an email at rep88, that's REP88, at ohiohouse.gov, or you can give us a call at 614-466-1374. Thanks again for joining us for What's Clickin' with State Representative Gary Click. We'll be back again soon to let you know what's clickin' in